this is really a call for us to think about, in a world that hates us so much, we need to love ourselves and each other more than this world hates us.
Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. My guest this week will be the human rights activist and former Amnesty International Field Director, Kalaya'an Mendoza. Just as a quick intro, Kalaya'an has spent over 20 years fighting for social justice, from LGBT equality to working for Tibetan Independence to anti-racist organising and much, much more. Most recently, he was field director with Amnesty International USA, and he also led the Tactical Safety and Security Unit within the human rights observation deployments in Ferguson, to the DNC and the RNC, also in Charlotte, and most recently in Standing Rock. His work as an activist, as an organiser, as well as a trainer of other activists and organisers, has been recognised by human rights icons like the Dalai Lama of Tibet, and it's been featured in publications from the New York Times to Out magazine, and he's been honoured by many local governments across the US. In this conversation, our goal is to present an accessible and engaging introduction to social justice concepts that can often be a little bit jargony. So we talk about things like privilege and microaggressions and discrimination, with the goal of certainly not covering everything, but the goal of providing a quick crash course that anyone can sit down and listen to, or stand up and listen to if you feel so compelled. We're also real about some of the challenges that face social justice movements, and Kalaya'an offers a strong critique of what he calls call-out culture, an aggressive, confrontational approach to calling out discrimination. He argues a more compassionate, dialogue-based approach is the way to go. So, for those of you who haven't been talked through this set of concepts yet, I hope you find this a good introduction. And for those of you who've maybe been put off from this sort of social justice language before, I hope you'll give it another go and listen with an open mind. One final point is that neither me or Kalaya'an are representing a particular organisation here. Any views expressed are our own. And with that said, it's my pleasure to bring you Kalaya'an Mendoza. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here today with Kalaya'an, who has worked in movement work, organising and social justice for quite a while now, and we're just going to be talking today about the basic social justice concepts and the future of them. Kalaya'an, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Toby. I'm excited to be on here.
Do you want to just tell our listeners a bit about yourself, how you got involved in this sort of work and some of the things that you've done?
Most definitely. Thank you. Yeah. I started way back in junior high school, back in the early 90s, as a student organizer. On my campus, there were numerous sweeps by the San Jose Police Department to quote unquote interview Filipino and Vietnamese students with regard to the gang affiliation. Mm-hmm. I organized an action at the Board of Supervisors meeting calling this, racial profiling. Myself and other organizers were also brought in and interviewed and asked questions about our gang affiliations. From that, we were able to basically win a task force made up of students and community partners that oversaw the SJPD at that time. And since then, I've worked alongside the Tibetan community, my own community, Filipino, LGBTQ, all of the communities that and identities that I inhabit and work with. And most recently, was working with Amnesty International USA as a field director, supervising field organizers across the country and working on our human rights observer work with the research team.
Great. One thing I should add for our listeners is Kalaya'an very generously agreed to come on today, even though he's recovering from a cold. He has, and this is a weird compliment to pay you, probably one of the best public speaking voices I've ever heard, which is weird given how very laid back and empathetic you are in normal conversation. In terms of sheer technical ability to project, I've seen you audibly talk to 90 people over the sound of jackhammers in the background. So that's a bit of an aside, but
Thank you. I have older Tibetan women who have rocked protests for years that taught me that. So thank you. Yeah.
So let's just jump straight into this, because I think some people who are listening will already be down with a lot of what we're talking about. Some will sort of have heard of it and not know, but there'll be a large category of people who, when we talk about privilege or microaggressions or whatever, those terms will come to them pre-stigmatized. It just seems like there's an industry online right now of either not understanding or willfully misunderstanding what we're talking about when we talk about these things. And I don't want this to be the meat of the interview, but how do you think about that, and what would you say to someone who has only encountered these concepts through a very negative filter?
I always have to ask what makes people so averse to social justice, which essentially is about human rights and equity. And most of the times I do have relatives and other folks in my periphery that have shared really straight up hateful memes that don't come from a place of understanding, but rather from a place of just invalidating work that's happened. I think it comes from a place of fear and willfully holding on to what folks know. And I think, as we've seen, at least in this country, during different transitions and moments of awakening, the majority has not reacted well to it. That when we do talk about social justice, that we really center, human rights, love, compassion, those universal values that we all have, and just try to I like to say decolonize, but really make it more accessible for everyone. I know that folks who are like, what is a cis heteropatriarchy? Rather than breaking it down that way, meeting folks where they're at. Because I found that when you actually have a conversation with folks and it's not a yelling match, that people are more likely to, at the very least, leave that conversation thinking about it. Civil discourse from, if you look at any Facebook or any Facebook conversation, has spun sometimes out of control. And we need to, one, think about how much energy we're putting into that, and two, think about our approach.
Yeah, and it's perhaps a sign of how far down the rabbit hole I've gone that I can hear cis heteronormative patriarchy and just completely understand what you meant without that being jargon. Well, let's actually just get into some of these terms, right? Because on the one hand, sometimes jargon is useful On the other, sometimes like it can be a barrier. So let's just start with some key terms. You said structures of oppression. This is pretty much the center of what social justice is working against. What do you mean by structures of oppression? Because I think most people think there's good and bad people and they're going to do what they're going to do, whereas the way most social justice people see it is more systematic than that, right?
Mm-hmm, definitely. Structures of oppression such as racism. When I talk about racism, yes, I'm talking about the racism that happens when someone uses a slur, but more I'm more focused on dismantling the entire system of racism. And what does that look like? So this country was built on racist ideologies, manifest destiny, colonization, coming over to subjugate and educate, and eventually try to committing genocide against the native population. The use of Africans as slave labor, which is intrinsically tied to how this country was able to fund itself in its nascent stages. These things, when people say, well, racism's over, it's not over. It continues today, to this day. If you look at the number of Black men who are in prison, the number of Black men in prison does not match the number of Black men in the population of Black men in U.S. society. So one must question, why is that? One of the most marginalized groups in this country are Native Americans. And if you look at the rates of alcoholism, of domestic violence, of disappearances, and of incarceration, and of police killing, or killings by police of Native Americans, one has to wonder, why is that? Where does this come from? And if you take a few steps back, you could see that it's a systemic disenfranchisement of that community, whether it's through the reservation system or the boarding school system. These are things that have been instituted by the U.S. government that continues its oppression to this day of these communities, leading us to think of them as Native American communities as almost pretty much gone or disappeared. Quite frankly, in this country, we haven't really spoken about Native American issues until Standing Rock happened in April of 2016. So when folks who do social justice work talk about systems of oppression, we're talking about addressing large-scale systems that affect the lives of so many people within that particular group.
Right, and I think, like you say, there's sort of an emotional reaction to hearing that people have, right? Which is either like, it's not my fault personally, or to victim blame, to say, well, you know, maybe if Black men go to prison more, or if Native Americans are susceptible to alcoholism more, it's just because those communities, those individuals in those communities are making worse decisions. But that's sort of, you've got to apply it back and say, well, okay, even if that is the case, why? Is it genetics, or is it history and culture? Because it's going to be one of the two, right? And I think we can pretty confidently say it's not genetics. There's no innate differences between races or anything like that. So where did that come from? It comes from, in the case of Black men in prison, a criminal justice system that had its origins in violently oppressing that minority, and even after that, in a sense, viewed itself as protecting white people from them rather than protecting everyone. So the sort of like, what I hear people saying is, well, you know, don't blame me for other people having bad lives, but you've got to go back a layer behind that, right?
Exactly. You have to go deeper, and I think everyone has that ability to critically analyze why things are the way they are. And when folks do try to deflect and say, well, that's, I had nothing to do with that, I ask, I was like, but do you benefit from it? For instance, I benefit from misogyny. I benefit from the oppression of women. I benefit from all of these privileges that I inhabit. And these are all things that I have either knowingly or unknowingly, these are advantages I've unknowingly or unknowingly gained. And regardless of whether or not I was an agent in that oppression, I still benefit from it. So that's something that we need to talk about. It's not about just blaming people. It's about us taking accountability as a society and figuring out ways to make things more equitable, because that's the only way that we're able to go forward in this world.
So
just together.
So yeah, let's move on to the word privilege, because if I think there's one social justice concept that really gets misunderstood, it's this. So we talk we as in people who are sort of in social justice, right, talk all the time about privilege, like white privilege, male privilege, whatever. And I think this gets misheard. So in your own words, what does it mean to have privilege? Is this something people should be feeling bad or guilty about, or is it more something to be aware of and like cognizant of? I'm sort of putting words in your mouth. So what does privilege mean to you?
Yeah, privilege is simply earned or unearned advantages that allow you to advance in society. And a privilege I have is I am able-bodied, even though I'm seen as able-bodied, even though I have a hearing impairment, or I am viewed as a cisgender male, and with that comes the privilege of people thinking that if I walk into a room, I'm more likely to be the leader. I'm more likely to know what I'm doing. I can't tell you the number of times that I have co-facilitated a training where people would address me more than my co-facilitator, who would most usually be a cisgender woman. Privilege is these things that we benefit from, and I think it's something that we do need to be aware of. And a lot of times folks...
Because this is like, I think, a big misapprehension in that, because when you talk about people being less fortunate than you, it makes people feel guilty, right? And it's not even like racial oppression, sexism. It's even stuff like seeing an image of like a starving kid on TV prompts something of defensiveness in you, right? And I think, just to rewind what you just said, there's one thing that's really important is we, and by we I mean sort of people who are engaged in social justice activism, our goal is not to make you feel guilty, because if nothing else, it's actually not a particularly useful emotion. It's a paralyzing emotion, right? And
Correct.
You see so often, like, I got to call out my pale-skinned brethren, but white people in particular, really just wallowing in how bad they feel about all of this. And like, that's great, but what are you doing? You know, like that's actually not what we're asking. And then the male privilege thing, if you're sort of doubting, if you're listening to what we're saying and thinking, we're maybe being overreactive, or come on, is it really that bad? Just like, I can talk for myself, the number of times my wife has made an argument and then I've made the exact same point, and then for some reason when I said it, people just understood it, you know? Once you start, just have that software running in your brain, just notice, if you're a guy, how you can just say the same thing a woman said just before you, and you'll be the one recognized for that point. It doesn't matter where you are, in conservative, liberal, different, cultural settings, whatever. And once you see it, you really can't unsee it.
It's kind of like the whole concept of kind of like awakening to the reality of the world, right? Once we start to identify these different types of phenomena, it's like, oh wow. For instance, one of my friends challenged me. She said, next time you're in a meeting, take a tally of the number of times that women were interrupted versus how men were interrupted. And this was like way in my early part of my process, and it tripped me out that every single meeting I would go to would have very similar results, where men were the number of times women were interrupted was vastly higher than the number of times men were interrupted. So it's all about being situationally aware about the situations that we're in, and starting to identify that.
I would assume many of the meetings you just referenced were not, you weren't going into the Republican Country Club or anything. These were presumably meetings of social justice activists, right?
Yes.
So these behaviors they're not universal in the degree. I'm sure it's worse in some places, but it's sort of everywhere. And then this also goes to sort of what we're asking people to do, because, like I said, the goal isn't or shouldn't be to make people feel uncomfortable or guilty. That's a byproduct. If it happens, you work through it. But just to stay with this one example of men getting more attention, more recognition, talking over women, there's a few really basic behaviors you can implement. So you can, if you're like me and you're always the one talking in meetings, you can take a step back. But then more specifically, if you see a woman being interrupted, not every time it happens, but just make it a point. You can say, oh, sorry, I wanted to hear what Jane was saying, and just exercise a bit of male privilege to turn the mic back to her. And then also just making sure you're giving equal recognition, right? So if a woman makes a good point, say, oh, that was a really good point, I appreciated hearing it, so that it just draws, again, the attention and so on back. And I think when people think about social justice, they sort of imagine being in the streets, which we've both done, you more than me, but a lot of it just starts with small kindnesses and courtesies and recognizing that some people are denied those kindnesses more than others. Did that make sense?
Yes, it definitely does. And it's about being a decent human being. That's essentially it.
Right.
And recognizing that there are messed up things in the world, and because of that, people might not experience life in the same way that you do. So it's your job as a person on this planet to try to make life a little less crappy for everyone here. I know that's essentializing it in a way, but I think that if people look at it in that way rather than trying to figure out how do we fight for this grand revolution, then things can be a little bit better than when we came into this world.
Yeah, and I think it also makes it more comprehensible to people who haven't been sort of through the induction process that we have, which is like, before we get to the big political stuff, let's just talk about how we can treat the people around us nicely, Let's just talk about everyone in the room feeling comfortable. Let's start there and build up. One final term I wanted to just quickly cover before we get to like the future of social justice work is microaggressions, because again, I think this is one that gets willfully misunderstood. But I'm going to let you define it first before I...
Sure. Dr. Gerald Wing-Sue, who basically created the term microaggression, states it's an everyday encounter of subtle discrimination that people of various marginalized groups experience throughout their lives. An example of this is something that I've experienced is sometimes I will wear Filipino regalia to a conference. And
some of which is absolutely beautiful, by the way. I hope that isn't white tokenizing, but some of your necklaces and stuff are amazing.
Thank you. I try. But it's nice for people to be like, oh, that's really pretty. But I've been at conferences where I've had, especially older white people, for instance, grab my pineapple silk tunic, and I'm like, don't touch me with your hands, and they don't understand that. They think that they think that that's they're like, no, I meant to compliment you. But in the course of my life, I have had a lot of white people, mainly white men, gay and straight, put their hands on me without my consent. So if you think about it, and I think Toby, you described it very well once, where it's like either a mosquito bite or getting sliced, over and over and over and over and over again. After a while, it just becomes absolutely insufferable. So microaggressions are the small things that happen that build up over time. And you hear about this a lot with especially Black women having people ask, can I touch your hair? Or I've had, when I would go out to different meetings, people tell me that I speak really good English. So it may seem like a small or insignificant thing, but over the course of a lifetime, it amounts to being eroded down almost to like a raw nerve.
Yeah, so I think what you were referencing is I have a really basic training on these where I sort of just like tell a story. So I'm like, let's just take male, female, right? But you could do it with anything. A lot of times men will use microaggressions on women that are sort of like, hey babe, hey sweetie, hands on the body, not even like sexual, but hands on the body without consent, stuff like this, right? And it's really easy when you're in the position of, I'll use the jargon, when you're in the privileged position, right? So like when you're the man in that situation, to be like, this is not a big deal, get over it. And the point is, yeah, if it only ever happened once, sure, it probably wouldn't be a big deal. But when the woman says to you, you know what, I am not your babe, I am not your sweetie, maybe on her way into work she got catcalled. Maybe on her way into work, almost certainly she was had to look at, big posters of scantily clad, objectified women. Maybe someone made a comment about something being man's work. Maybe someone was slightly sexually aggressive in the way they got on the elevator with her. Maybe whatever, right? And then when it's the 30th one of those things, you're like, you know what, I've fucking had it with you. Like, no, don't call me babe. And I think when you're the guy in that situation, you don't see the 31s leading up to that. You see the one that prompted an outburst. And a big part of, like, the sort of ideas that social justice types are propagating is to see the 30 that led up to it. If that's the thing you were referencing there.
Yes, it definitely was.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add with microaggressions before we move on to like the future?
I would just like to plug, there's a great book by Professor Kevin Nadal on microaggressions and traumatic stress that takes a look at how microaggressions are lead up to clinical trauma. It's a fascinating book, and I think it's something that that it's going to be a field that we're going to have much more scholarly work around, because I know that when I talk to folks who are not privy to this, they're like, oh, you guys are just making up things.
Right.
And it's like, actually, there's scientific evidence and studies that show this leads to mental health issues. This leads to not addiction, but abuse of substances. So that's one thing I would just like add to that is like this is a somewhat new field, but is gaining traction by the day.
One final point for people who are still coming from a you're exaggerating point of view is very few of us are never in the non-privileged space, and just think that for every one of us there is something that really sticks in your craw. And so I would challenge everyone, even for, I'm fairly privileged, I'm a white, straight guy, right? But for everyone, there's some sort of vector of the time you're looked down upon, and just think about how you feel,
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that approach that you have, where you question where folks are coming from, because I think that's a perfect way to have a teachable moment, right? Whenever someone has said something what I feel might be problematic, I like to come from a place of not assuming and just ask. If one of my youth activists one time was like, "Oh yeah, that's so gay," I'm like, "Oh, what does that mean?" They're like, "Oh, it's dumb." I was like, "Well, how does gay and dumb, how does that equate to one another?" So just helping folks along that, rather than outright being like, "You're messed up." It is something that we can do as allies as well, that I think works really well. If we hear something in earshot or witness something that is potentially a microaggression, and the marginalized person in community, just you can tell when someone's had it, you can then ask that question and bring it up right there and address it right there, and be the one to take on the emotional labor of addressing it rather than leaving it on the marginalized person.
Yeah, and just to revisit this, it doesn't make you a bad or an evil person that you've used microaggressions, right? Because I remember, when I was in high school, right, the gay thing, right? The number one thing you could say to denigrate something was to call it gay, right? And to the point where it didn't even make sense. It'd be like, "Yeah, man, your bike's dead gay-like." That's kind of how they talk there. Your bike's gay. Well, what, it likes other red bikes? What are we talking about here? But it's saying that gay is something that can be used to mock, or that there's something inherently ridiculous or silly or not serious or even not moral about gayness, which there isn't, right? So that is something that people would be within their rights to get upset by. But my God, this was hardwired into me. It took a lot of being in these sorts of circles to really unlearn calling things gay, because it was just so ubiquitous, right?
Definitely.
I get it, So let's move on to the future of this, because here's the thing, and here's the central challenge that I think we need to solve, and we haven't, is this stuff is ubiquitous. It is drilled into you, and you'll be perpetuating it and, slighting people and offending them and using stuff that can make them feel less than without even realizing it, right? You can get better, but it really is the water in which we swim. And there is a caricature of social justice people which does have a degree of truth to it, that we are very reactive to this stuff, that we're always getting offended by everything, that we're really policing people's language, that it's actually quite difficult to be in these spaces for long periods of time. And I think sometimes that is just that. It's a caricature, but it can get a bit much sometimes. And I saw a while ago you shared an article called "Excommunicate Me from the Church of Social Justice," which I'll link to. And you said this was something that spoke to you. So I'd just like to ask you about that. And just on a personal level, what was your reaction to that article?
Yeah. So the writer talks about this fear of being in activist spaces, because it's almost become toxic to speak, because there's something called call-out culture, which is I feel is not helpful, especially when you are working within your community. An example of this is I'm guilty of contributing to this. Right after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, there were a group of Asian American activists around the country that wanted to start addressing anti-Black racism within our own community. And in that, one of the calls was to have conversations with our family members, many of whom hold anti-Black sentiments, And there was I felt, I understood the intention, but I felt the impact was going to be extremely negative because there was a sense of making your family feel like garbage for something that they might have not understood, rather than coming from a place of compassion. And I found it really problematic in that we were going to re-traumatize our families rather than trying to educate them. And I know some folks had really good conversations with their families. Others, it became just like a call-out thing, like mom and dad, you're racist because of X, Y, and Z, and you leave them with that. I think, at least in the Filipino community, there's definitely is racism, and we can thank the Spanish colonizers for that legacy. But rather than coming from a place of compassion, and if your family were former refugees who escaped and who have been, your parents have been trying to scrap together a life for you, and were able to send you to university, an elite university where you might have been lucky enough to get this analysis, and now you're throwing it back in their face. We need to question why we're doing that and why we're coming in from that way. I don't like being in spaces where call-out culture is the only way to address things. I think we need to come from a place of love, love for ourselves, and a love for our people. It doesn't help, and it's not, quite frankly, it's not strategic to jump down people's throats constantly. Let's have a conversation. Let's really think about, no one was born woke. No one was born with this level of political social consciousness. Let's help to midwife people into a place where they can understand and really just have center love in this. I think Grace Lee Boggs said it best in a conversation with Angela Davis back in 2012. We need to move away from protest organizing and towards visionary organizing. And to me, what visionary organizing means is to bring everyone together to come up with a shared vision of what the future can look like. Rather than being reactive, let us work together to build and create that which we are trying to protect and maintain, that which we want to have. What is a world that we want? And if we replicate the same colonizer patterns of denigrating those who don't have the information to us, we should be ashamed of ourselves, quite frankly. So I think that, and I'm not about shaming people, and I know that this might come off as that, but this is really a call for us to think about, in a world that hates us so much, we need to love ourselves and each other more than this world hates us. So.
Yeah, I just want to the people who go on about, social justice warriors and this and, that and the other, I just really want them to just listen to, the last 2 minutes of you talking, because that is as reasonable and as nuanced approach as you're going to get in the face of, genuinely really difficult stuff that many people are struggling against, right? Let me give you my reaction to that article, and I want you to tell me what you think of this, because here's what I thought is, I've heard people say a whole load of times that, social justice warriors are overreactive and the call-out thing can be too much. But I honestly haven't taken it that seriously when it's coming from the outside, right? When it's people who don't know or understand what we're talking about. But what I noticed with the Excommunicate Me from the Church of Social Justice was the people who were sharing it and saying that this really spoke to them were all from multiple marginalized identities. Let me just decode myself there. They were all people who had multiple things about them that could or would be discriminated against. So, I think the article was written by a queer trans person of colour. I hope I got that right. And the people who were sharing it tended to be people of colour who were also gay or also trans, or, you know what I mean? They're people who can genuinely claim to have had all sorts of discrimination thrown at them. And I found it interesting that seemed to be the group that it spoke to the most. Because I won't lie, like, I personally have had some moments where I sort of inwardly roll my eyes in social justice circles, and I sort of think to myself, you're being a bit much. But I usually don't take it so personally for two reasons. One, superficially, do I want to be the white guy telling a bunch of people of colour or black people that they're wrong about racism? Not really. It's just not a great look, right? But then the second point is I have other places I can go where I feel accepted or welcomed when I need to blow off steam. So I'm just thinking, like, last night, right? I live on Staten Island. This is Trumpville, right? They love the guy here. I go to my local bar. It's in a bowling alley. It's pretty much all white. Not always, but usually, like, they stand up when a patriotic song comes on. You know, like, it's that sort of place. I'm fine. I'll get the odd stupid question about being British, but I'm fine. If I were a trans queer person of colour, would I be? Well, maybe not, right? And when I sort of feel that social justice spaces are being a bit much, I can just go into other spaces. But if you're coming from a place of multiple marginalised identities, these are maybe the only places you feel like you can get sanctuary. And there's got to be something really not okay about that one sanctuary now becoming a place that people who, if anyone has, license to talk about being discriminated against, like black trans people do, right? If they're saying that these spaces are now feeling threatening to them, we've really gone wrong somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And no, I talked for a bit. I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there's this new wave of activists that are, coming into their own analysis and their own frameworks around critical theory that are really, hardcore. Like, I'm going to call this out because that means that we can address it. But it's something that I was lucky enough to have been mentored by folks to be like, hey, you need to chill. I remember back in 2004 when I was taking notes at the Women of Color conference for one of our Asian Pacific Islander caucus. We were talking about how no one would. It was a light moment where we were laughing about that no one would ever be using white supremacy in the general population, and now we hear about it all over the news. And at that same conference, there was a lot of spaces for how do we democratize and make this really people-powered, this word people-powered. And what it meant was building bridges with folks from privileged backgrounds or privileged identities and building them up, whether that mean white allies, cis male allies or cis allies, straight allies, and having that very strategic approach at finding messengers that others can actually relate to. And it was out of that wanting to build together that I feel, at least at that time, things were extremely hopeful. But right now, I think that trauma and both primary and secondary trauma are surfacing in ways that make folks within social justice spaces want to lash out at one another. And that's not helpful. And that's not what we're about.
Yeah, particularly if the people you're lashing out at are, to use the jargon, less privileged than yourself, right?
Exactly.
Because I've got some, like, radical black radical friends who would, in response to what we're saying, would essentially say, well, fuck you, white guy, I don't need to care about your feelings. That's not what's going on here. I mean, I can actually hear that to an extent, but I've seen white women call out and scold black trans people, black trans women, right? And really, like, dress them up and down for some, like, in a way that just seems to lack self-awareness. I'll put it no more strongly than that.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's kind of, you have to take a moment and you're like, what just happened? Right?
So, final thoughts is we've seen a really remarkable evolution of this ideology, right? Like, there's this whole set of interlinked concepts of, intersectionality, microaggressions, privilege, whatever. And these have really come in the last 20 years, maybe, that this has become like a fully fledged thing. That, I mean, okay, 20 years is a while, but it's actually not that long a time when it comes to the evolution of political thought structures, right? Because we're still debating liberalism versus socialism versus libertarianism, right? These are belief systems that came about in the 1800s, and they've changed since then. But it really is that sort of like intergenerational, centuries-long vector of change for like our underlying concepts and words and values. This sort of social justice terminology has come and gained some sort of prevalence really, really fast. Do you sort of wonder, where are we going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Will it have completely changed again? Will it have... I think it's only reasonable to think that it might, right?
Oh, definitely. It's a constant evolution in how we see the world. I still remember, it wasn't that long ago when people would say, was it Afro-Americans? I mean, like, terminologies change all the time, and it's really on the marginalized community to set how they are identified, and it'll, as more communities rise up and find their power, they'll be the ones to advocate and say, this is, I'm setting the terms on how we want to be addressed. And I'm setting the terms on how I want to be seen as a human being. So, yeah, we could definitely expect things to change. And my advice for folks that are like, oh, there's so much stuff that I can't memorize it. I was like, yes, you can. We have the capacity and the capability to do that. It's just the easy way out to say that we don't want to. And it's a small thing to ask for someone to say, to use trans instead of some other antiquated term. And we have the internet. So the resources are out there, and it's, and allies are out there. So reach out to folks that are doing the work who come from your community to help break these down for you. So.
It's maybe a bit of an aside, but just one thing that I did want to get in here at some point was, like, when people are like, oh, it's too complicated, you're bringing too many words in, you guys are overreactive. I mean, I hear that, maybe sometimes we are, but like the one example they always give is using preferred pronouns, as if this is like a ridiculous, superfluous request. And this, I think, is a mistake. It really isn't. This is quite integral to respecting someone as a human being, And if you doubt that, just talk to a cis for people who don't know, just means someone who isn't trans. Talk to a cis man and call him young girl for like 2 minutes and just watch what happens, right? Like, people hate being misgendered, right? And we can totally get that when applied to us. But whenever people are sort of, just to piggyback off your like, oh, it's too many, it's too confusing, it's really not. Like, pronouns, at least, if you don't know what cis means, sure, that's fine. But like, using the right pronouns, I think, should be pretty basic at this point.
Exactly. And it's just one way to convey your decency as a human being is to ask folks. And that's a lot of people are like scared about, like, how do I address it? Just be like, excuse me, what are your pronouns? Or making the space more open and saying, my pronouns are he, him, and his, or whatever.
Yeah.
Your pronouns are. So there's a lot of tactical ways that we can bring this in that doesn't take reading an entire tome of social justice work to understand. And, like I said, it's just about being a decent human being.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And even if you don't buy every aspect of our ideology, I'll address people how they want to be dressed for ideologies I explicitly disagree with. So, like, back in my home country, England, they still have all of these preposterous titles like Baron and Lord and, whatever, right? If someone wants to be addressed that way, I will, even if I'm not 100% sold that is it just fine? You want to be called Baron von Liechtenstein? Sure, like, and for something that's even more fundamental to their identity, and for people who, because if anyone's oppressed, trans people are, right? And that's not to invalidate other forms of oppression, but like black trans women have a 1 in 8 chance of being murdered. That's an insane statistic, right? And if people who are going through that want you to call them a certain thing, just bloody call them it, man. This is not costing you anything,
Exactly.
Okay, that was a bit of an aside. Final thoughts is, I think we both agree, right? Looking forward, this sort of worldview, concepts, labels, language has evolved really, really fast. We could be anywhere 20 years from now. Where should we be? Like where, if you were to look back on this conversation 20 years from now and be like, yeah, everything went exactly how I would have wanted it to, what would that look like?
Yeah, we're going to be on spaceships. I think looking in 20 years from now, we, just like how it has always happened, we'll look back and kind of laugh at, oh my gosh, I can't believe we were so backwards or archaic then. And see that there, I hate the word diversity sometimes, but working for a much more equitable world, verdant, diversified world is one that just makes it a better world for all of us. And we're stronger as a people when we recognize each other's differences rather than try to pretend that they're not there, and to really listen to people's stories, right? In 20 years, many of these things are going to be, they're going to be points of shame. And it's on us whether or not we want to be on the side of history that is about fighting for everyone's rights and space as a human being, or fighting against their rights to live and be happy. So. Yeah.
So, wrapping it up on that note, if anyone was listening to this and thought, you know what, I would, not just like I should be doing more, but like I could, it might be fun to do something practical to support that vision, what resources would you want to refer them to?
Definitely. I would first suggest, and this is what I always suggest, is for folks to look up Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. And it talks, it's a couple pages, and it talks specifically about privilege and what privilege is and isn't. That's a really good starting point. I would look up works by there's a fantastic Native American scholar named Professor Adrian Keene at Brown University that talks about cultural appropriation. There are numerous scholars from marginalized backgrounds that are leading in this work that I think it's high time that we listen to. But really, it starts off in recognizing that we inhabit both places of oppression and privilege, and that we can utilize our privilege to support and uplift those who are who do not have the advantages that we do. And I'm happy to leave more of my information on here.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there any sort of Twitter handle or website you'd want people to follow you personally at?
Yeah, you can follow me at Kala Mendoza, KALA or my website is Kalaya'an Mendoza, KALAYAAN and there's numerous folks on Twitter to follow. If you just look up the hashtag social justice or intersectionality. But yeah, there's a big, beautiful world out there of this information. The most important thing is taking that first step and figuring out whether you want to make this world a little bit better than when you came into it.
All right. that seems like a good full stop. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was awesome.
Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, then you can catch our other episodes. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm also working on getting our iTunes account set up. Links to all of that are on our website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. And if you want to support the show, really the best way to do that, it's a new show, is just help us get the word out, either by sharing or tagging friends who you think might like it. And know that I'm really genuinely grateful for anyone who does share or do anything else to help get the word out. I may make a few changes to my schedule and my release dates, and I'll post those on social media. Apart from that, thank you again for listening.